Okay, this lesson is all about arms, and this first video is going to get us started with just the very basics of doing arms. Now, most of what we're going to talk about is also going to apply to the legs, so we're going to cover a lot of ground here that's going to basically take care of limbs in general. Now, let's first note that the project is all set up just like we looked at in the importing video. If you haven't taken Character Animation Bootcamp, when you watch the last video, you may have noticed that my workspace is not a traditional workspace. In Character Animation Bootcamp, we talked about rearranging the workspace to make it more advantageous for character animation. And the same setup that works well for character animation works very well for character rigging as well. So I've got my view window on the side. Most of the time you're going to be working with bipeds. Quadrupeds come along, but it's mostly bipeds, so a little narrower composition window doesn't hurt anything. Oh, and by the way, if you have two monitors, as I have, I just put this over on the other monitor, so I have a whole monitor of this. But in case you only have one monitor, and of course for the video lessons I have to work with one monitor here, I just squeeze that in on the side there. And then in the middle we have our info window, previews, align, those tools up above. I have my effects control window. This is very important because we're going to be working with this a lot. And then of course our dear trusty Duik down below here. And that allows the rest of the screen to be taken up with the timeline and the project window when we need to look at that. But more importantly, we can have the timeline stretch from the top to the bottom of the screen when we need to be looking at a lot of layers, and you'll see pretty soon why we want to be able to do that. If for any reason you haven't already downloaded and installed the free Duik script, by all means stop the video and do it now. We're going to begin working with it now, and it's pretty much going to be our constant companion for the rest of the course. Alright, we're going to focus on her right arm here. So I'm going to select these layers and I'm going to solo them. So all we're looking at is those layers. And I use solo buttons a lot as well. Rigging is so complicated, and it really helps me to kind of isolate things so that I'm not having to look at a million different layers when I'm working. So the next thing we want to do is make sure we have guides to snap to. And if we solo the guides here, we've got a little issue. This was imported from Illustrator, and these were all grouped together, which means they came in just as a single layer. So we can't snap to these right now, but because it's a vector layer, we can actually use this Create Shapes from Vector Layer command. Hit that, and then we can actually delete that. And now we have actual After Effects shape layers that have been traced from those vectors. So this now will allow us to snap. So I'm going to turn that on and I'm going to lock it. It's a little harsh here. Let's just turn the opacity down, so because we don't really need to see them, we just need to snap to them. Okay, so we've got those ready to go. Our very first step is going to be anchor points. This is not a basic After Effects course, so I do not think I have to explain anchor points, but obviously they are the point from which the layer will rotate and will figure its position in After Effects. So we're going to immediately start by getting all of these anchor points set up so we create a realistic looking arm when we rotate the joints. So starting with the upper arm here, we're going to grab the Pan Behind tool, and I'm going to click and drag up to the top because we want the upper arm, of course, to rotate at the shoulder. And I'm going to hold down the Command key to engage snapping. And notice it's hard to snap when I'm pulled back. I got to zoom in here. Closer in we are, the easier that'll be to snap. But I got that to snap pretty good. And then we're going to go to the lower arm. And of course the lower arm should rotate at the elbow. And we'll do the same thing. Snap that guy into place. And then the hand, rotating at the wrist. And then the fingers. Okay. We could turn off our guides now. We don't need those. And you'll notice that because we've snapped those anchor points so carefully with this clean vector art, we're getting really, really clean overlaps at the joints. All right, now that we've got our anchor points set, now we're ready to set up our FK chain. And what do I mean by that? What I'm talking about is forward kinematics. And what you will know it as is simply parenting in After Effects. That's really all we're talking about here, is just building a parenting chain where we have a parent. In this case, it'll be the upper arm, and then each subsequent layer will become a child of the other layer, making our forward kinematic chain. So this just works very logically. We're going to parent the fingers to the hand to the lower arm to the upper arm, okay? And the upper arm becomes the parent of them all. So of course, if we rotate the upper arm, all of the other pieces go along with it. If we rotate the lower arm, all the pieces below the lower arm in the parenting chain go with that, and so on. Now here's the thing. We could stop right here. That is rigging right there. We have already rigged this arm. It functions as an arm. If I open all of these rotation attributes here, I can one by one, by positioning each one, I can create exactly the kind of pose that I need for my arm. And right now we're including the hand as well, although we'll do a separate lesson focusing on different ways of rigging hands. But we're going to be throwing in some basic hand rigs as we cover arm basics. Now, a forward kinematic rig is perfectly acceptable in some situations, and there are a few situations where it could even be preferred to an IK chain, an inverse kinematic chain. There are honestly more advantages to using an IK chain over an FK chain, and even though there's pros and cons to IK and FK chains, our awesome Duix script will give us the option, once our arm is rigged, of switching between IK and FK, so we're going to get the best of both worlds anyway. And even when we're building an IK chain, an inverse kinematic chain, we still have to start with an FK chain. So I keep talking about inverse kinematics. What is it exactly? Well, I've set up a little example here because it's a lot easier to show than to tell. And once we've looked at the example, then we'll come back and actually build an IK chain. But let's take a look at one. So here in this IK arm example file here, you see we have just her arm here. And you can see that rather than having a bunch of different layers, I just have one layer right here, this controller layer. Notice I can't click on any of the parts even. They're all locked away and they're shied away. And the only thing I can click on is this controller. And when I click and drag on the controller, it actually picks up and moves that hand. It leaves the upper joint, the parent joint, in place, and allows me to really naturally and very intuitively pose this arm. The hand down at the bottom can be posed by holding down the W key and then rotating that hand off of the end of the arm. And again, very easily here, I can create the poses I need. Now, I don't have control added yet for the fingers. We'll do that a little later on so we can also control the fingers. But this is just the basics of an IK chain. The IK system recognizes the original parenting structure of the FK system, but it adds a rule where it fixes the position of the bottom of the chain, and it fixes the position at the top of the chain, so that if you move the bottom of the chain, the top part stays in place, and if you move the top part of the chain, the bottom part of the chain stays in place. And the joint in between them positions itself automatically depending on the relationship of the other two. So inverse kinematics gives us a lot of advantages over forward kinematics. For one thing, you're going to have fewer keyframes on fewer layers, because rather than having keyframes on all of these different layers, all you have to do is keyframe the position and rotation of the controller in order to pose the entire arm. Of course, the arm will be also affected by where the upper arm is, and that'll be controlled by what that is parented to, most likely the torso or chest. But between those two things, you're posing an arm essentially just with two attributes. Now, of course, we're going to be adding things like control for the fingers, and later on we're going to add more controls, but we're still reducing the number of keyframes and the number of layers that we're dealing with. And we're making things a lot more intuitive. This kind of control over the arm feels more natural. It feels the way you would want the arm to move. Now, there's another part of IK that is really important in terms of an advantage over FK, and that is creating the illusion of gravity when you place an IK chain on legs and feet. That way, when you move the torso, the feet stay on the ground, and when you pick up the foot, the torso stays in place. Quite frankly, it's nearly impossible to create that illusion effectively without IK. It takes a lot of monkeying around, and it's rarely going to be perfect. The IK chain makes this easy and is one of the most important reasons why you pretty much always want to choose it, particularly, again, because Duik allows you to switch between IK and FK. And really, FK's one advantage, which is that it works a little better for creating overlap and follow-through animation, is honestly IK's only disadvantage. Fluid overlap and follow-through between the upper and the lower arm is tricky with an IK system, since so much is happening sort of automatically based on the position of the hand controller. Also, to create that kind of animation, you often have to switch the IK orientation back and forth, which can also be tricky to do smoothly. With an FK system, that kind of overlap and follow-through is easy because you simply have to offset keyframes. But since Duik gives us the option to switch between IK and FK, and since the bulk of the advantages weigh on the side of IK, you pretty much just want to go ahead and put it on all of your limbs. There's really very little reason why you wouldn't want to do it. Alright, well, now that I've hopefully convinced you that IK with Duik is the way to go, let's go ahead and set up an IK chain. Let's pop back to our farmer woman here, and we're basically ready to go. We just have to create the controller and then use the Duik script to create the IK. So let's start by creating the controller. Now, Duik has a new controller system that has some really nice advantages to it. It sort of prefabricates your controllers, it locks certain attributes, and it uses little symbols in order to communicate what kind of controller it is. And I love Duik with all my heart. I think it's a fantastic tool, but I have to say I'm not super crazy about the controller symbols. I'm very sensitive about being able to be in touch with the artwork of the character itself, and I really don't like imposing other graphics on top. So I actually don't like using the prefabricated Duik controllers. And part of this might be that I'm just sort of old school now because I've been doing this for a little while. So one thing that I would recommend, if you want to follow along with me and do exactly what I'm doing, you're going to want to change a couple of preferences. So let's go ahead to the settings here, and I'll just show you how I have these set up. We're going to go to the rigging settings, and you can see I have my bones set to nulls. Now the default is to set it to a solid. I much prefer working with nulls. I think they're much less disruptive visually. I'm going to go ahead and leave auto size on, and I set it to medium. That makes the nulls, it automatically sizes the nulls to match sort of the scale of what you're doing, and it works fine. We're going to leave it, of course, placed over the layer. Now this is the other significant difference here, change from the defaults. I change my controller types to nulls rather than the icons. And again, this is mainly because I just don't like the visual interference of the icons. By choosing the null object controller, you do lose the advantage of the kind of prefabrication that goes into the controllers, mostly dealing with locking attributes that the controller isn't actually using. But we can do that very easily manually with the lock property button. And it's actually not a bad idea to go through it manually anyway, so you kind of understand what it's doing. If at the end of this course you want to actually use Duik's prefabricated icon controllers. His free PDF user guide does a great job of covering how they work. So what the controller button's job is, whether you use the icons or the nulls, is to allow you to select a layer. When you hit the controller button, it's going to create a null object or a shape layer icon with an anchor point in exactly the same position as the layer that we've selected. This can be achieved manually, just creating a null object and snapping it. But using the controller button is a little quicker, and if you want to use the prefabricated icons, as I said, there are some advantages to that if you don't mind the graphic interface. So when we're creating an IK chain for an arm, we want the controller to share an anchor point with the wrist. The controller is essentially going to be the hand. We grab the hand and we move it around. And we want it to rotate at the same place the hand rotates, which is at the wrist. So I'm going to go ahead and select the hand layer here, and I'm going to hit the controller button, and you can see it just popped a null into place with the exact same anchor point. I'm going to rename this null right away. And you want to name your controllers pretty quickly. You can sometimes have trouble with your rigging if you try to change the names of the controllers later on. It's not supposed to cause a problem. Everything is supposed to update, but I have seen problems happen, so it's better to play it safe. Try to get the naming of your controllers done right out of the gate. Now you'll notice that we are deviating from our established naming convention when we name the controller. But also note that we're still giving the controller a unique name within the comp. There is no other layer called right_hand. And the reason why we want to name this a little more simply and a little bit less clinically is because this is going to be one of the actual controllers that the animator sees and clicks and drags on. So our controllers will all get unique names, but we will give them names that are a little simpler and more intuitive for the animator. Then I'm going to make some adjustments here. I'm going to change the size of this controller so that it fits a little more around the hand. Let's do like 200 by 300. And then we're also going to change the anchor point here so that it fits around the hand in kind of a natural, sort of intuitive way. And again, the idea here is that as the animator, we want to be able to just say, I got to grab that hand, and just click and drag. So we want to give some space. We want to give a decent amount of room to click and drag easily. But we also want to surround the hand in kind of an intuitive way so that it's sort of easy to understand what the control is and what the control does. I tend to like to sort of round my numbers off, so once I've figured out roughly what number I'm setting at, I always try to round it off. Okay, so there now we have our right hand controller in place. We're ready to create our IK chain. So for Duik to create an IK chain for you, it's going to have to write a whole bunch of crazy code on the layers that we're working with. So we need to select those layers in a particular order in order to tell Duik what it is we're trying to create. And it's also very important to understand that we have to have our FK parenting in place before we do this. Duik will not work unless we have this parenting in place. So Duik wants us to select from the bottom of our IK chain to the top of our IK chain. And then we're going to select the controller. Actually, the newest version of Duik doesn't actually require selecting in that perfect order as long as you've already got the layers parented correctly. Duik has become very smart. It tends to kind of know what you're trying to do based on what you select. But I continue to select in that correct order for two reasons. One, it kind of helps me think through what I'm doing. And two, I sometimes forget to parent first, and will sometimes go ahead and try to run my IK script before I've parented. And in that case, if you've selected in the correct order, your IK script will still run correctly, and then you can parent afterwards to get everything to work correctly. This is another one of those safety things. And I have to admit, on top of those other two reasons, I've been using Duik a long time, and it just still feels right to me to select in order. But again, the current version, if the parenting is done and done correctly, all you have to do is select the layers in any order. Although you should still always select the controller last. So let's go ahead and select these layers in order, both for safety and so that we're really clear on what's going on as we're learning. For an arm, the bottom of the IK chain is the hand, and the top of the IK chain is the upper arm. We're not going to include the fingers in our IK chain, although we will add controls for the fingers on the hand controller later on. So let's go ahead and set this up. We're going to select the hand first. We're going to hold down the command key and select the lower arm, the upper arm. So again, from the bottom of the chain up to the top of the chain. Then we're going to select the controller. Then we're going to hit the IK button. Now we've got two choices here. The 3-layer IK, which creates kind of U-shaped curves. This isn't what we want for a human arm. Or a 2-layer IK with a goal. That is what we want for a human arm or a human foot. So then we just have to hit the Create button. And you can see that some controls have been added to our controller here. And now if we lock our art layers, and it's a good idea to lock those art layers because we don't really want to be able to click on them and reposition them now. And now if we move our controller, you can see it's now controlling our IK chain. Be careful to undo back to the neutral position of the hand controller. Until we zero out that value, we have to be careful not to lose that neutral position. But we don't necessarily want to zero it out until we've finished all of our controller parenting at the end of the process. To be safe, you can either note the position values at that neutral position, or if you're really worried about it, go ahead and zero it out. Just understand that you're going to have to unparent it from the zeroing null, and then delete that null, and then re-zero the controller after it's parented. For simple jointed rigs, I usually manage to just be careful to always Command Z back to its neutral position when I'm testing things out. But later on, when we work with the Puppet tool, I will zero out some controllers ahead of parenting since we have to do a lot more testing with the Puppet tool. Now let's take a look at the controls that we have here. The first one up at the top basically just reverses the orientation of the bend. So it pushes the bend to the right or to the left depending on what kind of pose you're looking for or where it's positioned on the body. This is very useful, of course, and gives you a lot of flexibility to create a lot of different kinds of poses with your arm. But it can also be a little tricky in animation to switch back and forth between these two. But that's available to you there as a checkbox. Next we have the FK tab here, and if we open that up you can see we have a checkbox whereby we can disable the IK completely, and we can use these controllers here to control the rotation of the upper and lower arm. That allows us to animate an FK when we have a situation where it's more advantageous. As I said, in particular with overlap and follow-through, that's a big help. Now you'll notice that as I'm doing that, notice that the hand remains pointed downward. That's because right now we have the goal on. And what the goal does is subtle but kind of important. Let's go ahead and re-enable the IK and just get a clear idea of what the goal does. So when I click and drag on this controller, the upper and lower arms rotate automatically based on the positions of the shoulder and the wrist, in other words, the bottom and the top of the IK chain. But the hand's rotation doesn't change, and the hand only rotates when I rotate the controller. And if we just think about this for a minute, remember the hand is actually parented to the lower arm. If the lower arm rotates, then the hand, its child, should really rotate too. What the goal does is disable the child from inheriting the rotation value of the parent. So it still inherits the position, so everything stays connected, but it doesn't inherit the rotation of its parent, the lower arm. Now, if I turn the goal off, like so, now when I pick up the hand, now it does inherit the rotation value of its parent. Now this can have its uses, but it's pretty rare. The vast majority of the time you're going to want that goal on. This works the same way if we disable the IK system and we turn the goal on. You can see that when we rotate the lower arm, it does not rotate the hand. When we turn the goal off and we rotate the lower arm, the hand rotates in a normal way as if it was parented. Now the next thing down is the stretch controls, but because we are dealing with just jointed parts here and we're not using the puppet tool, we don't have any stretching capability at all. In fact, you can see what's happening when I try to stretch. The pieces just come apart. So all we want to do when we have this kind of a rig set up with just layered pieces and no puppet tool, we want to turn auto stretching off so that the arm doesn't break apart into pieces. The controller disengages. The controller, once we pull it too far away, stops connecting with the wrist, but we also don't get that weird thing of the limbs separating, which isn't very useful. Now we also want to be able to control this little finger layer. Now obviously these aren't real fingers. She's got a mitten hand here, but we do have a separated part for those fingers, and it will allow us to create more expressive poses with our hand. So let's go ahead and go through that process, and this is something we're going to do a lot of in this course. So this will just be our beginning working with expressions and expression controls. So we want to be able to keep all of the controls for this hand and arm combination all on this one controller so that all of our keyframes for everything are all in this one layer. So we're going to select the controller and we're going to add an expression control. So under Effect, we're going to go to Expression Controls and we're going to choose an Angle Control, and that adds the angle control to our effects controls. I'm going to name this Fingers. Then we're going to lock the effects control window. So I'm going to go ahead and lock that effects control window there. That will mean that the effects control window will stay on the right hand controls even if I select another layer. And now we're going to unlock and select the finger layer, and notice again that our right hand controls stayed in the window here because we locked it. And then I'm going to hit the R key to open the rotation value, and we're now going to tie the rotation of these fingers to this expression control. If you haven't worked with expressions in After Effects before, you may want to take a little time and familiarize yourself with their basic functions. Expressions are basically little pieces of code that we can attach to attributes in order to get them to be controlled by other attributes or get automatic behaviors like oscillations and wiggles. They really open up a whole new world to After Effects if you're not aware. Now what we're going to be doing here is really basic, but we're going to get into some deeper expression usage as the course goes on. So in order to enable expressions on this attribute, we're going to Option click on that attribute, and then we're going to grab the pick whip here, and we're going to pick whip from this attribute to the angle control, our fingers angle control in our locked effects control window here, and let go. And it adds this little piece of code that basically just says this angle will now drive this angle here. So now as we rotate this, it now controls our fingers. So we can lock this back up again, and we can now click and drag on our controller. We can position the whole arm, and then we can rotate the fingers, hold down the W key, and we can rotate the hand itself to get the pose we need for the entire arm. And now we have a really nice, intuitive, and flexible control over this arm. Okay, now just a little side note here, now that we're beginning to work with DOIX IK script. If you ever need to remove IK from the chain, either because you need to start over or you're going to set up a different kind of IK chain, you'll want to make sure and remove the IK completely so you don't have any remnant code floating around that could cause you problems later on down the line. So what you're going to want to do to remove IK from your chain is to remove all expressions from the rotation properties on all of the layers involved, remove all expressions from the position of the layers, remove the effect that's on both the root layer and the end layer, and then remove the effect from the controller. Now you can safely either re-rig or rig differently as you need to. Now this kind of simple jointed IK system works great and has some really nice advantages. One of the biggest advantages, of course, are these beautiful clean joints. You're never really going to get crisp, clean joints like this with the Puppet tool. This kind of arm rig is also simpler to set up than a Puppet tool rig in a lot of ways, but it does lack that stretching capability, which is really nice to have, particularly for sort of broad, cartoony characters. Also, some artwork will not support jointing so easily. So if your artwork can't be jointed easily, or if you need that stretchy quality, or both, we need to use a Puppet tool rig. But before we move on and build a Puppet tool rig, we need to do a little cleanup work here with the rig we've started. All we've done is the one arm here, but we want to start prepping for our sort of final cleanup at the end. And so we want to make sure we have a few layer settings set so that we'll be in good shape for cleaning up when the rig is finished. So remember that the whole idea of rigging is to make the animation process easy for the animator. What we're doing in a way is creating kind of a simple user interface for this character, so we want to think through what's going to be the most advantageous thing for the animator. And the main idea here is that we want to get to a place where we can see the artwork and we can see the controllers, but we can't see any additional mess, and we don't really have much additional mess with this simple rig, but we will very soon when we start working with the Puppet tool. We're going to have a lot of null objects and things that we're going to want to hide. And we also don't want to be able to accidentally click and drag on the artwork and potentially break our rig. We only want to be able to click and drag on our controllers. And then we also want to make sure that we don't get into irritating situations like this where you try to grab your controller and instead it starts to scale out. That's a really annoying thing when you're in the midst of working and you're trying to just grab and click on a controller and you accidentally hit that corner and you're scaling. It's very frustrating. And you also just want to fail-safe it, especially if you're passing the rig on to someone else. You kind of want to make sure that all of the guts, as it were, are hidden away so that the animator doesn't accidentally break anything in the rig, which would cause them time and trouble and you time and trouble. So protecting all of those things, making it kind of bulletproof and, for lack of a better term, idiot-proof, or maybe I should say animator-proof, is the name of the game here. So what we want to do, we're just going to focus on this little bit here, but we'll kind of continue this process as we rig the different parts of the figure. We've got the locks right here. We want all of this artwork locked, and we want to lock things like guides and stuff like that as well, just anything that could be clicked and dragged on. We want our visibility turned on for all the artwork and the controller, of course. So that's good to go there. We'll just ignore these solo buttons for now. And obviously we have the visibility off on things like guides and stuff. That's kind of an obvious one. If you want to play it really safe with guides, you can actually turn the layer into a guide layer, which prevents it from ever being rendered in case you accidentally leave it on. That's up to you. Generally just being careful and making sure that stuff is turned off is pretty easy. But that is an option to like super fail-safe it. And then the last thing we want to do is set our shy buttons here. One of the nice things about the shy buttons is it allows us to clean up the timeline. And when you're animating, you're only going to have like a handful of controllers, but there's going to be a lot of attributes on those controllers. And you want as much screen real estate as possible. And also, you just don't need to look at any of this stuff. This is all going to be buried inside the rig. We really don't need anybody to touch or interact with these things. So what we're going to do is we're basically going to shy everything except the controller. And then when we hit the shy button, then we get this incredibly nice clean interface here where I can't click on the artwork. I can click on the controller and manipulate the artwork, but I can't accidentally break the rig or anything like that. Now the last thing we want to do is lock some of the properties on this right-hand controller. The only properties we need to animate here are position and rotation. We don't need scale. We certainly don't want anybody messing with the anchor point. That can get weird with IK systems. And we don't need any opacity, obviously, although that's not really going to do anything. It's already set at 0. But it's a good idea at minimum, to lock the scale. So I'm going to select the scale property, and I'm going to just hit the lock property. And all this does is just sort of put a very, very simple little code here that just locks this property into this value of 100. And so now even if I go and click on that corner, I can't scale it. So I remove that kind of irritating thing. Because this lock property is so simple, I usually just go ahead and kind of lock everything that I'm not using, even if it's probably kind of overkill. But I'm kind of an overkill kind of a person when it comes to rigging. I'm always kind of willing to go that little bit of an extra step for safety, to keep things secure, to keep things easy for the animator, all that kind of stuff. So it doesn't take but a second there. And then once again, now we have a very, very easy interface, no accidental scaling. We can position, we can rotate, which is all we need to do with that controller. And we're going to keep practicing these good cleanup techniques every time we rig. And now, obviously, when we go back to rigging, we'll just turn the shy off so we can see all the guts and get back to work. But this is our goal, is a nice clean interface for each and every body part and for the rig as a whole. Now let's go ahead and take a look at creating a puppet tool rig for an arm. Now before we actually build the rig, let's take a look at a side-by-side comparison of a jointed rig like the one we just created and a puppet tool rig. And in this case we're going to use this hipster lady with the outlines here. So on this side here, you can see that we've got a jointed arm. Now let's zoom in here a little bit. And you can see that it's working pretty well. There is a break in the pattern here. This stripe here stops and breaks, and then it picks up again here. But because we've set up this line work carefully, as we discussed in the prepping video, we're still getting a pretty nice looking joint there. So this is really not bad, and I think probably most people would think this would be acceptable and kind of in keeping with the style of the character that has a little bit of a cutout look to it. But this can potentially be a problem if you have more detail in the figure. If you have shading, for example, shading can be kind of tough because you get this kind of interruption in the shading that doesn't look very natural. And again, it depends. It really, really depends on the style of the artwork and what the artwork looks like. Some stuff is going to look okay jointed like this. Some stuff just isn't. And then we have this hand here that we kind of talked about a little bit before. We've got a little bit of a limitation here with that cuff. But again, it looks pretty good, and even in these extreme poses, it works all right to create that illusion there. So not too bad overall. Now we've still got our limitations. In other words, we can't stretch this, and oops, stretching is actually turned on. We should actually just turn that off because it's not doing us any good, so we'll take auto stretch off there. So again, there's no stretching capability here. And again, this arm happens to look pretty good jointed, some will not. So if you want that stretchy, or you're having trouble with the texture or level of detail, then you want to go with the puppet tool. So over on this side we have a puppet tooled arm. You can see there that it took a little bit slower there on the processor. That's one of the things about using the puppet tool. It's definitely much more of a memory hog, and it's going to slow down your renders a little bit. But it does have some really nice advantages. Now let's note that we don't have anything like the really crisp round joint that we have here. This is one of the big advantages of jointing, is this very crisp elbow. And you can see here we have a much less crisp elbow. Now again, it's not bad, and we have a continuation of the pattern. The pattern's now not broken, and again, if we had shading or higher level of detail, that could be very, very important. And we've used some of the tools with the puppet tool, in particular overlap, to make sure that we're getting kind of a decent looking line inclusion here as this line comes in and crosses over. But notice at these kind of middle points here, let's stop right there. You can see one of the disadvantages of the puppet tool. And that is that you can get a lot of distortion in the artwork, some of which is attractive and some of which is not. Here's a good example of what the puppet tool can sometimes do to the edges of the artwork as it bends. You get these little pinches that can sometimes not look very good, and it really affects your outlines in particular. As you can see here, we're losing all the thickness of the outline in this little pinch. And you can see once that pinch kind of closes, it starts to look better again. This is just one of the things about the puppet tool that you have to kind of work with. Now usually one of the disadvantages of a puppet tool rig on a limb is that you're often going to get a more limited range of motion, particularly with more complex artwork. But in a case like this, with this simple arm, we're getting a really good range of motion from this puppet tool rig. But just like with the jointed arm, some artwork will work well with the puppet tool, some artwork will not. So often the puppet tool rigs will have a much more limited range of motion, especially with more complicated artwork. But you can see here that with the right artwork and the right puppet tool setup, you can get very good range of motion with the puppet tool rigs. Now a jointed arm pretty much has a guaranteed wide range of motion if prepped and rigged correctly. It'll be more hit and miss with the puppet tool. And again, the more complicated the artwork, the more hit and miss it's going to be in terms of your range of motion. One of the big advantages we've gained now is now we do have that stretchy IK, which can be really, really handy for really cartoony and exaggerated movements. Although, just a little note, I never push this too far. I'll definitely use it and it can come in very, very handy. But I tend to use it a little bit sparingly because it doesn't really squash and stretch. In other words, it doesn't maintain volume. It literally just stretches. So you can't push it too far, or else there's sort of an expectation that there should be some squashing happening with the stretching. That's a little bit too sophisticated for the puppet tool just on its own. Now this cuff situation was a little bit tricky for layering. It ended up working pretty good jointed here. Here we have it puppet tooled, and it's working all right, but it's giving us a little bit of a problem, which is we're getting a little bit of a counterbend here despite having this starched pretty good. Now this is a potential problem with a 100% puppet tooled limb. Despite careful starching, which we'll explain in a minute, we're getting this weird counterbend in the lower arm. Won't happen in every case. I've been using the puppet tool for years and I'm still not always able to predict its behavior, but once in a while you'll see this kind of thing happen, particularly with a full limb that is puppet tooled all the way along. In this particular case, the jointed hand is more successful than the hand that's on the 100% puppet tool rigged arm. And in a later lesson, we're going to talk about how to actually combine a jointed wrist with a puppet tooled arm if you wanted the advantages of the puppet tool on the arm, but you were unhappy with the puppet tooling on the wrist. And we're going to show you a couple different ways of combining these different techniques for different situations. But you can see there that on the puppet tool and the jointed side, there's pros and cons. And when we put together this rig, you'll see that one of the cons of the puppet tool rig is it is quite a bit more complicated to rig up. But there are those significant advantages as well. You're going to need to approach every situation individually and try different things, try one, try the other, find out which works best for your artwork, for your character, and the kind of movement that you want. Generally, the jointed limbs are going to have a much wider range of motion than the puppet tooled limbs. Although in this case here, we're getting pretty good results from both. And that might be partly because we sort of design these characters with rigging in mind to some degree. And you will have those advantages too once you start kind of applying your knowledge of rigging to your design and construction process. Okay, let's go ahead and rig up an arm using the puppet tool. We're going to use this hipster man here. And this character was actually separated for jointing. But what we're going to do is we're going to combine some of these layers together. We're going to pre-compose them together and essentially flatten the arms into one piece so that we can apply the puppet tool to the entire arm. Okay, to start with, we need to provide ourselves a guide because we're going to pre-compose this and then we're going to crop the comp. So it's going to shift out of position here and we need to return it to its correct position. So I'm just going to grab this upper arm here and quick duplicate it, and I'm just going to throw that down underneath there. And I might even, like, you know, make it gray or something so I remember this isn't really part of our rig here. Okay, then we're going to select all the layers that make up the arm. We want to make sure to get the cuff in there as well. And then we're going to pre-compose these together. When we get to the pre-comp here, we're going to name this G left arm comp. And then we'll click Open New Composition here, make sure that's toggled on, and click OK. And so here's our little arm here, but it is in the full size composition, and we want to crop this in so we're not dealing with all that space we don't really need to. So for that, we're going to use a handy little trick here. Some people know this one, I find a lot of people don't, but we're going to use the region of interest. And if you don't know region of interest, what this is meant for is to isolate an area for RAM preview, so After Effects only has to render what's in the little box here. But it also has another nice little feature to it, which is that we can use it as a cropping tool. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to crop this fairly loose just in case maybe we want to add some props or something later. And by the way, if you were planning to add some props to the hands or something, you would want to make sure you leave room for that. We'll keep this one fairly snug. We'll do props later and talk that through at a different lesson. But that'll work. So there we've got a fairly tight crop around that hand just to get rid of some of this excess space here. And now we're going to use this great trick. So you go under Composition and you'll see Crop Comp to Region of Interest. Boom. And it actually crops the comp down to that size. Great. It's essentially a crop tool. It's just not called that, but you can use it that way. Okay, so now we've got this all set up, and just for future note, we're also going to show you later a rig where you can actually move the fingers within the puppet tool rig, but we'll do that a little later on. But it's good that we still have these all separate so we have options like that in our rigging process. Okay, let's go back to the hipster man comp now, and you can see, of course, that now his arm is centered itself in the middle of the frame here, and we need to reposition it over the old arm position here. So what we're going to do is we're going to solo these two layers, and on the layer on top here I'm going to change to a difference blend, and that'll mean that whenever it crosses, when it's actually fully lined up, it'll essentially turn black. And this is a fairly handy way. I'm going to turn up my resolution here just temporarily, and we're going to zoom in as close as we can and get this as snug as possible. Okay, there. Essentially everything went black. I was looking for the little details to go black. Got pretty close there. Now, you may think I'm being a little overly anal here, but I'm very sensitive to character design, and even very, very small changes to alignment of the limbs or the body parts can really affect character design. So I tend to be pretty slavish about it, so particularly if I'm working with a character designer, so that they can really see that I rigged their character and didn't alter it even just a little bit. So I'm pretty uptight about doing those kinds of alignments, and it doesn't take very long to do it. Okay, so now we can take our difference, blend off, and we can delete our guide layer there because we just needed that for the position. And now we're ready to set up this puppet tool rig. Now I'm assuming that most of you, if you're watching this course, have had some experience with the puppet tool, but perhaps not, and don't worry if you haven't had any experience with the puppet tool before. I'm going to walk through every step and we'll go through each part of it carefully. But the puppet tool, as you saw in the example, basically allows us to bend and flex and stretch artwork rather than simply moving its position and rotation as we did with the jointed parts. So our first step, of course, was to pre-compose this arm so it is a single layer, and then we're going to apply the puppet tool to this single layer. So let's go ahead and start, and we'll explain kind of what's happening and why we're doing what we're doing as we go along. One thing, we'll want to turn this back to red, return it to our color coding, even though it's all combined into one layer. It still should have its own color code. Okay, we're going to rig this arm all with the puppet tool, but we're also going to include this arm layer in our parenting chain as we put the whole rig together. So I want to first set this anchor point up at the shoulder where it should be for this arm. So we're going to go ahead and turn on these markers here, and I think we're going to have to copy and paste them in actually so that we have some things to snap to here. So I'm going to really quick just go in here and grab these. We'll paste those in. I'll actually turn this one off. Okay. And we'll set all of these to multiply to make that easy, and we'll lock them as well so we don't get into any trouble here. Okay, and now we'll go ahead and grab our pan behind tool, and we'll hold down the command key and snap that anchor point into place. Okay, so even when you're using the puppet tool, which essentially supplants sort of basic parenting, and we'll talk about that as we go along here, you still want to anchor point everything correctly, and I really like to include the artwork in the parenting so that we're making the puppet tool not work so hard. And again, we'll discuss that as we get further in. Okay, I'm going to leave those markers on because we're going to use those to guide us in placing our puppet pins. And I'm going to go ahead and hit the puppet pin tool. That's the little push pin up here at the end of the tool set. And I want you to adjust some settings just while you're following along with me here, because these are not the default settings that most likely you're going to see, particularly if you've never used the puppet tool before. So first we have the show mesh. I want you to make sure that's checked on, so we are showing the mesh. Then I want you to change the expansion to 20. That's a pretty good average size. It tends to work for me in a lot of situations. And then set the triangle count to 1500. Unless you have a very old or slow machine, then you might want to turn that down to 750 or even lower. Be aware that the lower this number, the worse your deformation will be as you bend and flex the artwork. But you can turn the triangles down while you're working and then turn them back up before you render as sort of a workaround between the quality and the performance. But I'm going to keep it set to 1500 for these lessons. Once you have those settings in place, we're ready to place our pins. And it doesn't really matter what order we do these in. I usually try to do them in a logical order depending on where I start from, but it doesn't really matter exactly where we start from. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. And the first one, I'm going to try to pin it pretty darn close to the anchor point. Now, it's not absolutely necessary that it's perfectly on, but it'll help if it's very close. So I'm going to go ahead and hit that first pin. Now, as soon as I've added that pin, actually a number of things have happened that we need to stop and talk about just so you understand what the puppet tool is doing and how it works. By adding that initial pin, we've added the puppet tool effect to our layer, and more importantly, we've added a mesh around the layer. So let's zoom out here just a little bit and take a look. And you can see that it's essentially read the edge of the alpha channel. It's added 20 pixels expansion around that, and then sort of wrapped that mesh around the artwork. And then you'll see these little triangles here. That's our triangle count at 1500. And these are sort of similar in a crude way to polygons in 3D software, in that the more you have, the softer and cleaner your deformation is. But now we've also added a puppet pin, and you don't see that right away. So let's go ahead and have a look at that before we add more pins. I'm going to select this layer, and I'm going to hit the U key. And the U key will open any keyframed attribute. And in this case, with the puppet tool, when we add a puppet pin, it not only adds the pin itself, but it immediately adds a keyframe at whatever position your CTI is in. So an important note here, always have your CTI at 0, at frame 0, when you're working with the puppet tool. Otherwise, you'll have a bunch of keyframes scattered around out in your timeline. But this keyframe comes automatically with the placement of the pin. All right, now you might be saying, well, what's a pin? You keep talking about these pins. We'll get there. It's going to be easier to show than to tell. So let's add more pins. Now, where we're adding these pins are at the joints. The pins are where the artwork will rotate around. So we want the pins to be essentially in the same places that we put our anchor points for the jointing process. So again, we put one up here in the same place as the anchor point of the shoulder. And then these, we can just sort of eyeball these. We don't need to be so precise, but we want to kind of eyeball in the middle of that circle there for a second pin. And then we'll go in the middle of this wrist here. Oops, we didn't quite get in the middle. I'm going to do a little better job there. Again, we don't have to be quite perfect in this particular case, but it's good to be as close to that center position as you can. All right, now we have 3 pins. If I select that layer and hit the U key there, that pops open their position attributes there and their keyframes. But we're not done yet. We need a few more pins to complete this process. So let's play around with these pins a little bit so we can get a better understanding of how they work and why we need the additional pins. So I'm going to select the puppet effect here so my pins become visible. I'm also going to grab just the regular arrow tool because I don't want to accidentally add more pins right now. I just want to manipulate the ones we've got. So if I grab one of these pins, we start to move it around. Oops, and we should turn this back down to a 1/4 resolution. We don't need that set so high. If I pick this up and move this around, you can see how it is pivoting off the other 2 pins. We got to undo back here. And if I pick up the top pin, the same thing happens. Everything pivots off of those pins. You can see that it's affecting the entire artwork, sort of a counter bend as I move this back and forth. So it's great that we have all this deformation, but you can see it's not particularly easy to control. And right now I have no way to bend this hand because the pins have no rotation value. They only have position value, so I can't rotate this pin to move this part of the body. I can simply move the position of that pin and kind of waggle that hand around, which isn't really what we want ideally. Let me set this back to neutral here. We got to be careful here because I don't have these numbers memorized, and we got to make sure we're always returning to our neutral before we continue. So in order to be able to control the hand, we need at least one more pin, and I'll just for demonstration's sake, I'm going to add that additional pin there. And now you can see as I waggle that, now I can individually move that arm. Notice again that we're getting this kind of snaking up the arm, and we saw that we weren't able to entirely get rid of that in the arm on the hipster lady, we still got a little bit of that counter curve there happening. That's part of the nature of how the puppet tool works. Now don't get me wrong, I really love the puppet tool, but it definitely needs some help in terms of how you control these things. Now imagine if we didn't do anything else here. If I wanted to make any pose at all, like raising the arm in a wave, I have to position each individual pin. Look at that crazy stretching. I have to position each of these one by one in order to get the pose. And then I would have to animate them and make sure there's curves on the animation. It's really not a very intuitive way to work. Now ignore the soft bend here. That can be fixed with starching that we're going to talk about later. Or you may really like this soft bendy, and don't worry, we won't lose that if you like it. We can either keep it or we can get rid of it and have a crisper elbow. The important thing is just trying to manipulate these puppet pins is a poor way to animate. And that's where Duick's Bone script comes in super handy, because we'll be able to essentially parent these puppet pins through expressions to null objects, which means that they can be parented normally, and maybe more importantly, they can have rotation value, and then we can create a similar FK structure to the one we had with our jointed arm, but we will have the advantages of the puppet tool. Now I added this one pin here, but I think we actually need to add one additional pin, and I did this kind of out of order, but that's okay, we'll fix that in a minute. So I'm going to grab the puppet pin tool, and we're going to add one more pin, and I'm going to add it just at the kind of base of the fingers, sort of where the knuckles would be, right there. And the reason I'm going to do that is because we're actually going to add a little additional control that we didn't have on the hipster woman's hands. We're going to add just a little bit of finger bend, along with the ability to obviously rotate the hand itself. So now we've got 5 pins in place. I'm going to select the layer, hit that U key again to open all of those pins. And we also know that a couple of them kind of were done a little bit out of order, and we're going to want to get that a little more organized too. We can go ahead and turn off the visibility of the marker layers for now. Okay, so let's take a look at the pins. We created them top to bottom. Notice they're now bottom to top. First pin being the shoulder up at the top there, and then a pin at the elbow here, a pin at the wrist, and then here we got a little bit out of order. We have this pin down at the tip of the fingers and this pin here driving the hand. So let's go ahead and reverse that order, and what I'm going to do is just pick up the puppet pin 5 name here, just click and drag that down. You can see the black bars. I'm just going to drop that below puppet pin 4, and so now we're going right down the chain. 1, 2, 3, 5, 4. And don't worry about the names, because we're going to change all these names anyway. It's really important to name your puppet pins for a couple of reasons. First, just to stay organized and be able to quickly identify which part of the body the pin is associated with. Also, so that we're sure that every important element in our rig has its own unique name, and we don't have multiple puppet pin 1s, which we would have if we added puppet pins to all of these other arms and limbs and we just left the names like this. We'd have a bunch of duplicate names that could potentially cause a problem. And finally, because Duick will use the names we gave the pins to name the null objects that they're parented to. So getting these names correct right out the gate is really important. So I'm going to go ahead and name these, and we're going to use basically our same naming convention. The only difference is I'm going to throw a P at the end to signify that it's a puppet pin. Okay, let's rename these. I've named them not after the joint, but I've named them after the part of the body that they're actually going to be driving. This will make it easier for us to think through our rigging when we're parenting and setting things up. So we have the arm upper, the arm lower, the hand, the fingers, and then we have this extra pin, the fingertips, that will allow us to rotate from the fingers. But this will be the position from which we control the fingers, so that we call fingers. So now we've got these all named, and we're ready to add our bones. Now somewhere along the way here I accidentally hit the source name here. Let's click this back to layer names so we get our nice short layer names here. And let's go ahead and add the bones to these pins. Now the nice thing about this script is it's quite smart. If we want to add bones to all of these pins, all I have to do is just select the layer that has the pins on it and hit the bone button. If I wanted bones only on some of these pins, then I would select the individual pins like this and then hit the bone script, and it will only put bones on the selected pins. But we want all of these done, so I'm going to select the entire layer here and we'll hit bones. And there you can see that it immediately created a sequence of null objects. They are occupying exactly the same positions as each of our puppet pins. They carry the same name. The only difference is a B has been added to the front for bone. And now these null objects and their position now control those puppet pins. But more importantly, again, these null objects have more than just one property. They have our whole set of properties. So we can now parent these together and we can immediately create a simple FK chain. So let's go ahead and do that quickly. Fingertips to fingers, fingers to hand, hand to the lower arm to the upper arm. And now if I grab, for example, the lower arm and grab its rotation value, now I am bending that arm in a much more intuitive way. And this is why they call it bones, because it gives the illusion that there's a fixed distance between this null and this null, creating that sense of there being a rigid bone inside the figure. You can see we're still getting quite a bit of curl and bend here. If I was to rotate the hand a little bit more, see it kind of smooths that out and we get a nice soft curve. And by the way, it's a perfectly valid choice to choose the softer, more rubber hose style bending without crisp elbows and knees. So you can skip the starching process altogether, but be aware it may limit your range of motion in some situations. Now what we're doing here is a 100% puppet tooled arm all the way down to the hands and fingers. That in and of itself can kind of cause some extra problems. So one of the solutions to this is to use a combination that we'll look at in the next lesson that'll give you a little better of a rubber hose kind of a look. Now just to be clear, I'm talking about the style rubber hose. It's an old-fashioned term for, you know, rounded limbs without crisp knees and elbows. It's an old term. There is a new plugin or script for After Effects that's called Rubber Hose, which we'll talk about later on when we kind of go over some other rigging software packages. The important thing to understand about the Rubber Hose plugin is that it only works with vector artwork generated in After Effects. So it really doesn't work for raster art. That's one of the good things about the Puppet tool, is it's an extremely good solution for bending and deforming and flexing raster artwork. But the great thing that we've achieved here is that we're now utilizing the advantages of the Puppet tool in that it is stretchy and very flexible and can create soft distortions of our artwork, which can be really advantageous. But we're able to drive this Puppet system with a very sensible parented layering system, and in a minute we'll add IK to this, so we'll have an IK chain, and it really makes the Puppet tool suddenly a much more useful effect. Now I'm going to want to go ahead and finish this rig for the most part and add our controller and our IK chain before we do any starching. Or even decide whether we're going to do any starching, because it's a lot easier to manipulate the arm once it's rigged, and when you're starching you want to be able to manipulate the arm the way it is going to be manipulated in animation, so you can see how your starching and your overlapping is affecting the deformation of your artwork. Now we're just about ready to set up our IK chain here, and we're going to be doing that using these nulls that are now driving our puppet pins. But we have one more thing we want to parent in here. We've got our FK parenting all set up, which is our first step towards that IK chain, but we want to do one more thing here, and it bears a little side note here just so we're fully understanding what's happening with the puppet tool. As soon as we add puppet pins and a puppet mesh to a layer, those puppet pins now control that artwork on that layer. And to a certain degree, the layer of artwork becomes irrelevant. I can grab this upper arm right here, and if I begin to move it around the screen here, you'll notice I'm moving its position completely by moving this null object, which is dragging all these puppet pins up and down. It's all parented together here. But notice that the position of the artwork does not change as I'm doing that. That position stays exactly the same. So the position of the layer hasn't changed. I'm merely moving the puppet pins, and I'm dragging the artwork around. In fact, there you can see the bounding box of the layer right there. There's the bounding box, but I'm literally smearing the artwork around with these puppet pins. Now the problem with that is the artwork will start to drift kind of out of place the further away the puppet pin is from the position of the actual artwork layer. Now this does not really affect us very much with this kind of a very simple rig, but we're going to get into some more complicated arm rigs later on where that kind of precision becomes more important. So I generally do this now just as a general precaution and also just to keep things kind of neat and tidy. So what we're going to do is we're going to parent the actual arm artwork that, remember, has its anchor point up at the shoulder there. We're going to parent that to the upper arm null. So now when we pick up and move this null around, we're moving the puppet pins and we're moving the artwork. So we're stressing that puppet pin much less, and so we'll be bending the forearm and the fingers and all of that, but we'll actually be moving the upper part of the arm. We'll move the whole comp of the arm all together with it. Just makes things a little bit tidier, and as I said, it can prevent some breakdown in the consistency of the mesh once you move it a long way away from the source art. So just to recap, we've got null objects driving puppet pins, driving the artwork in this layer. And we've now just parented the artwork layer to that highest level null object that's driving the whole arm at this time. Okay, let's go ahead and create our IK chain. So remember, we want the controller to have the same anchor point as the hand, or the wrist. Okay, it's at the position of the wrist, but it's controlling the hand. So we're going to select that null. We're going to hit the controller button here. And remember again that we want to name our controller right away. So we're going to name this left hand. And then we're going to change the size of it so it fits a little bit better around the hand in an intuitive way. I'm going to try 450, see how that feels. Oh, that's probably a little big. Let's try that again. Try 400. There we go. And then we're going to alter this anchor point to pull that down. And again, we're trying to make a very intuitive kind of click and drag control here. I'm going to round that number off. We hit 81, so I'm just going to set that to 80. I always just kind of do that by feel, and then I round the number off. That tends to work well for me. I wonder, actually, let's just really quick, I like to do this when we're making controllers. Let's just temporarily turn off these solo buttons and quickly look at the whole figure. Yeah, that controller's maybe a little small. He's got small arms compared to his head and his body. Let's make that controller just a bit bigger, although it's going to start to encroach on the foot controller a little bit, so I don't want to go overboard here. So let's go maybe 350 and 450. And again, we're going to get a little overlap on that foot controller, which is too bad, but I think that makes more sense. Hand controllers get used a lot, so it's something you want to be able to click and drag on pretty easily. Now again, you can make your own decisions about this. If you don't like the larger controller, you can make it smaller, or you can make it even larger. Or again, if you want to use Duix shape layer controllers, you can do that as well. I just prefer nicely sized null objects. I always try to give as much click and drag space as possible without cluttering things up too much. Okay, now that we have our controller and we have our FK parenting done here, remember we just need to select from the bottom of the chain to the top of the chain and then the controller. So let's do that. Hand, lower arm, upper arm, controller, and then we're going to hit the IK button. And again, we want a 2-layer IK with goal. I'm going to create that, and then let's grab make sure we have our regular arrow tool and click and drag in that arm and see that yes, our IK is working. Hey, and look at that, we got our stretchiness there. That's awesome. And we have our ability to rotate our hand independently there, and we're going to go ahead and add a controller to rotate those fingers right away too. So again, we have a nice easy way to control the arm while we're playing around with Starch. So with the left hand controller selected, we're going to add an angle control, and we're going to call that angle control left fingers. Then we're going to lock the effect control window so this controller stays up here. We're going to go down to the finger null, and we're going to grab that rotation value, which allows us to bend those fingers. We're going to hold down the Option key, click on the stopwatch to enable expressions, grab the pick whip, and pick whip that up to the left finger control. Save that. Now we can rotate or bend these fingers with that little angle control. And oops, I got to turn my resolution down here. Let's get that back down to 1/4. Okay, there we go. So now I can control those fingers, and you can see it actually works pretty good to get sort of basic control over the fingers. Now at this point, I want to kind of proceed a little cautiously here. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to lock some layers here. I'm going to lock all of these layers now, because if we need to access them or deal with them, we'll unlock them as we need to. But we want to try to avoid messing with this stuff too much now until we start working with some of the refinements here. Now let's talk a little bit about Starch and what it does. The Starch tool will allow us to add stiffness to parts of our mesh so that there are areas that will deform less and seem more solid, particularly giving characters a sense of skeletal structure as it bends and flexes. Let's take a look at the arm without any starch, and as we talked about before, we get this kind of rubber hose soft curvature. But unfortunately, with the entire arm and the hand included, we also get these counter curves, and we get a lot of pinching at the elbow. We can clean this up a bit by bending the wrist, but you don't want to be restricted to posing the hand just to keep the arm looking good. That would limit your puppet way too much. As we mentioned earlier, the best solution if you want bendy rubber hose arms with raster art is to do a combo of the puppet tool and jointing. We'll look at that later, but for now, let's just do some basic starching to give this arm the illusion of having a skeleton with a more crisp elbow. Now this will not only give him that more structural skeletal look, but it'll also take care to a large degree of this pinching problem, and it'll hopefully fix some of the counter curving, although with a big long mesh with a lot of bending in it like this, it's tough to completely alleviate that. Now I'm going to undo back here to get this back into its neutral position, this controller, but we're also going to go ahead and zero this position value out, because we're going to need to play with this a lot as we are doing our starching and refinements here. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the 0 to zero out the position, and then now to return it to neutral we just pop it to 0. Now again, we're going to have to undo this and reset that once we get to the end of our process, but that's quite a ways off. So this will serve us fine for now, and it'll make things a little bit easier to work with during this part of the process. So let's go ahead and start with just some basic starching to make the upper and lower arms feel like they have skeletons inside them rather than rubber hoses. So I'm going to pick up and bend this arm a little bit so we can kind of see what it's doing here. And then we're going to unlock the artwork here. And we're going to open the effects window. We're going to select the puppet. And we're going to select the starch tool. Now look at the weird thing that just happened here. We've bent the arm, but as we turn on the mesh for the puppet tool, it is remaining straight. Notice it's at an angle because the artwork layer is parented to this upper arm null. But it's completely straight, which is kind of weird because we can see that it's bent here and we don't see it bent. But nonetheless, this is how we need to work in order to get this starch on here. So what we're going to do first is just starch this whole upper arm, but we want to leave an area here for flexibility in the elbow. Now we want to make sure and set our settings the right way first before we start squirting starch on here. The first setting we want is to check on the show mesh. This isn't absolutely necessary, but I think when you're starting out, this is a good way to really understand what's happening. Next, we want the amount set at a measly 1%. Now that seems crazy low, but believe me, you really don't want to raise the amount of starch much past 1% ever. I have occasionally gone to 1.5, I even did a 2 once, but usually I stay around 1%, sometimes less, sometimes 0.5. 1% takes care of, I would say, 98% of my problems when I'm dealing with starch. So we're going to leave that set at 1%. The extent is the amount of area of the mesh covered from the point we squirt the starch. So this is what we're going to be kind of playing around with and adjusting most of the time when we're getting our starch to cover our mesh correctly. So let's go ahead and get some starch in this upper arm and see what the results are. So I'm going to start by kind of squirting some starch sort of in the middle of these two joints, but favoring the shoulder a little because I want the starch to cover the shoulder. So I'm going to back up to about right here and I'm going to squirt. Now you see immediately that arm straightened out. And this is why I want to be able to bend the arm when I do this so I can see what's happening. Now we actually are stopping about in the right place here, but we don't have coverage here on the shoulder. So I'm going to move the starch, and I can click and drag on the starch a little bit, drag that up, and then I'm going to pull the extent out and expand it so I get coverage on that shoulder, and I kind of encroach in on that elbow there, so we leave just a little area of elbow. And you see that as I did that, I've kind of removed some of the pinching. I've still got a little baby pinch there, but some of the pinching has gone away, and we don't have that big giant distortion, that big giant pinching there. Okay, now that we've done that, let's add some starch to the lower arm here. Now here, we need to place that starch in between these two pins, leaving again some room for flexibility. We can leave fairly narrow room, but we got to leave some room for the flexible, bendable parts. So I'm going to start by squirting some starch in there, and that's way too much. So we're going to go ahead and pull that down. Okay. And I'm going to move that starch. Oops, I accidentally added a second one. I'm going to move that starch down a little, and we're going to shrink it some more. There we go. Now you can see how that elbow is starting to clean up back there. And we've actually got very little pinching happening now. And the forearm is nice and straight. Look at how we're getting quite a lot of distortion in that little cuff there, though. So we're going to want to try to fix that. I think what we want to do is maybe just roll this starch up just a teensy bit more, and then maybe just shrink it just a teeny bit more too. There we go. That's relaxing that just a little bit. And then now we want to put some starch down here through the hand, and we can include the cuff. So we'll kind of put the starch once again in between these pins, and we got to turn this extent way down now. Okay, there. Now you see how we've cleaned up that little cuff there. Let's pull that down just a little bit more. We want some flexibility. Now here I may actually do 2 small squirts just to cover this area. That's actually working pretty good though. It's not too bad. This is getting a little strange right in here. Let's see if we can fix that with a couple of smaller squirts here. I'll put a little bit right there. I'll turn that extent down quite a bit. Oops, up just a touch more. At a certain point I end up typing numbers in here. And 48. Still not quite. I kind of want to cover that whole little cuff there. There we go. Okay, and we'll put one more little squirt right there. Then we need to fuss around with the position and extent of the pins to get the desired deformation in the artwork. And take your time with this. It's going to take some time and some trial and error. And there's really never been sort of one solution that I've found that fits every situation. There I've got pretty decent deformation happening in that wrist. I've got pretty decent deformation happening in that elbow. And I'm not sure if we need to do anything for the fingers. Let's try just a little bit on the tip. Yeah, you see that? Straighten those out pretty good. And here I think we've got to just put just a little bit all along the tip there, and let's see if that'll work. Now this might stiffen those fingers too much, and you can see we're getting a little bit of a funny wobble right in there. Let's see if a little more starch here helps. Yeah, it does. So maybe I'm going to delete that one actually, and let's expand this one out just a little bit more. That does help. Okay. So you might be noting now that this is not an exact science by any means. But also notice that I'm trying to be frugal with the number of starch points I put in. I try to fill the areas as much by adjusting extent and the position of the starch rather than adding lots and lots and lots of points. But when you've got little delicate spots like this, you kind of need to put a few points in to get it to work right. Okay, let's rotate the fingers a little and see how those are looking. Okay, not too bad. You can see we're getting kind of a big pinch right there. Not too bad though. It's almost natural looking in terms of where that pinch is. But you know, honestly, those fingers, they feel a little too stiff. I think we may need to pull some of that starch off. So let's keep those bent. Let's go back and select our puppet again. And I'm going to try just removing all this starch and see if that gives us a slightly better feeling. Yeah, you know, even though that's kind of crazy and bendy, it actually kind of suits, I think, the style a little better. Ooh, that's kind of not so good, though. All right, here we're getting an ugly pinch there. Now that's probably because of this encroaching in there. So let's pull back on this a little bit. Now, you might be being driven crazy by this back and forth here, but this is kind of the nature of the game when you're dealing with starch. Okay, that didn't help very much. We still need a little starch in this tip. Keep those fingers straight. Let's just try to do, maybe we just need to try to really minimize it. Just on that side. Oh, I see I gotta kind of do it in the middle now. Let's try to make this as, pull that extent down a little. Whoops. There we go. Just the tiniest, tiniest little bit up along that edge. There, that keeps those fingers a little more firm. and they're not quite as stiff as they were. Okay, but again, see, if I go too far, it starts to look a little funky. And this is where that limited range of motion starts to happen when you're dealing with the puppet tool. There's some things that it's just not going to do all that well. Now this is looking pretty good, and it's even overlapping pretty well. Gets a little funky when we really crank on it, but I doubt we'll ever really have to do that. And let's kind of see how things are looking just if we bend this arm quite a bit. Hey, that's looking pretty nice. That's looking pretty good. I think once again, I'm not crazy about the results in the wrist, but it's not bad. It's actually not bad. And it's working a little bit better than it did on the outlined version. Okay. So there we have our puppet tooled rig. Let's turn this back into its neutral here. Alright, let's go ahead and do our cleanup just like we did with our other rig. So again, I want to lock that arm artwork. We're going to turn our shy buttons on here, and we're going to shy everything except the controller. We're going to go ahead and actually just lock everything because we have things turned on here. We'll just lock everything. And then we want to look at our visibility settings here. Our little null objects here that are driving our arm, we don't need to see those, so we can turn those off. And the only thing that we really need visible is the artwork and the controllers. So let's for now just solo the arm and solo the controller for the arm. And then once again, when we hit the shy button, we have this nice clean interface to control our arm. Then we want to lock the properties that we're not using. So let's go ahead and lock the anchor point, the scale, and the opacity, leaving the position and the rotation to control this arm. And let's not forget to extend our cleanup to our project as well. We want to keep everything organized in our timeline and everything organized in our project. So we've made a few messes here. Here something got imported and didn't get put away properly here, so let's open this up, make sure there's no comps in there. There's that marker comp again. We'll should probably identify that as being different. And let's get that put away here in the comps folder, and then the rest of this will go in art. And then we've got a couple of comps that we created here. These arm comps here, let's drop those into comps. Oh, and here's a little more artwork. Let's drop that into art. All right, there we go. So there you have it. Two different rigging techniques for arms, both very valuable with a mixture of pros and cons. In the next video lesson, we're going to go deeper into arms and talk about ways we can combine these two different techniques for specific situations.